Okay, so what we want to do in this video is introduce the idea, and later videos will go into more depth about these ideas, but introduce the idea of what is called a shift in the demand curve. Okay, so what we've already said about the law of demand. The law of demand states that with other factors held constant, ceteris paribus, an increase in the price of the good or service leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded, and a decrease in the price of the good or service leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of that good. Okay, so with the law of demand, we get a downward sloping demand curve. Absolutely no problem. And what we're saying here is if we go out and touch the demand curve at a price P1, we get a quantity Q1. The law of demand hasn't been displayed here yet because there has to be a change in the selling price of the good itself, good or service itself, in order to display whether or not the law of demand is being obeyed. So if we reduce the price, well, we see the quantity demanded, Q2, has increased. So yes, the law of demand has been obeyed. But we should know that because this demand curve here is downward sloping, showing that it does obey the law of demand. If we have an increase in price, well, then what happens to quantity demanded? And as we can see here, quantity demanded is reduced. The amount that consumers buy at price P2 is less or reduced compared to the quantity that consumers buy at price P1. And that again should be like innate to us at this stage, I would hope, because the demand curve is downward sloping, showing that it obeys the law of demand. So the law of demand tells that the quantity demanded depends on the price of the good. When the price of the good changes, this is known as a movement along the demand curve, and only a change in price can cause a movement. Now, I am aware that all of this thus far in this video is a revision, but still I think it's important. So a movement down the demand curve. What we are saying is that the demand curve itself has not changed. We have simply changed the price, which caused us to move from the point where P1 touches the demand curve to the point where P2 touches the demand curve. A movement is only ever caused by a change in price. Everything else has remained constant. We have moved down, in this case, the existing demand curve from here down to here. No problem. A movement up the demand curve is caused by an increase in price. We have moved from the point where P1 touches the demand curve up along the existing demand curve to where P2 touches the demand curve. We know that a movement is only ever caused by a change in the selling price of the good itself, ceteris paribus, all other things remaining equal. The demand curve itself has not changed. We have moved up the existing demand curve caused by a change in price. Now that's all the revision done. However, I think you can see, and the reason that I've been saying ceteris paribus all the time is because other things can change that will affect the amount of a good that people buy. That is not the selling price of the good itself. So one thing is taste of the consumer. What happens if a certain good comes into fashion? What happens if it falls out of fashion? That's going to affect the amount of the good that people can buy. What happens if the prices of substitutes? So if we're talking about Coca-Cola, what happens to the demand for Coca-Cola when Pepsi lowers its price? What happens to the demand for Coca-Cola when Pepsi increases its price? What happens to the demand for big cars if the price of petrol, a complement to big cars, goes up? What happens to the demand for big cars if the price of petrol goes down? What happens to the demand for the good today if people expect the price will go up or down in the future? What happens to the demand for the good today if people's income increases? Well, that depends on whether it's a normal or inferior good, and I'm not going to explain those now. I'm going to explain those in a later video. What happens to the amount that is bought of a good if the population rises or falls? And what happens to the demand for, let's say, ice cream if it's an unexpected very warm day? All of these different things are going to affect the demand, but not a movement, not in the same way the price affected it. They're going to cause what is called a shift of the demand curve. Now, you need to remember these 6 things here, and the acronym TOISS, TOEISS, will help you remember them, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to go just have a look at what a shift is. So an outward shift is when the demand curve changes, caused by a change in any one of the previous 6 factors, which are called non-price determinants. So an outward shift, before we do that, I'm going to say, look, P1 out to the demand curve, Q1, no problem. But an outward shift means the whole demand curve shifts out. And what I want to ask you is, well, does that mean people will buy more of the good at any given price or less of the good at any given price? Well, if I continue on from P1 out to the new demand curve, and I want to make it obvious, I've labeled it D2, what has happened? Well, at the price P1, people are buying more at the new demand curve following an outward shift of the demand curve than they were previously. But does that mean it's just at that price? And the thing is, I want you to see that no, it's not. It's at any given price. So at P2, the original amount that was bought, if you go out to the previous demand curve D1, was Q3. And now what we're saying is if you go out to the new demand curve, it's Q4. So what I want you to see is that at every price, more is bought, or at every effective price, because eventually this will go to zero, will touch the price axis and say there is a certain price that nothing will be bought. But at every effective price, more will be bought. And this is called an increase in demand. It is not called an increase in quantity demanded, because the whole demand curve is shift. A shift causes a change in demand. An outward shift means that more is bought at every price, and it's called an increase in demand. Well, obviously if it can shift outwards, it can shift inwards. The demand curve can shift inwards. So let's look at this here. Well, we're saying that at price P1, at the original demand curve, which is here, D1, Q1 is bought. But at price P1, if the whole demand curve shifts into D2, and remember that you're labeling it D2, showing that this is the new demand curve, well, what happens to the amount that is bought? Well, it's fallen. Okay? And then again, I'm sure you get this, but again, oh, is that just at the price P1? No, it's not. It's at every price, because originally at price P2, Q3 would have been bought, but now because the demand curve has shifted inwards, Q4 is bought because there has been an inward shift. So what are we saying? At every price, less is bought. And an inward shift in the demand curve is called a decrease in demand, not a decrease in quantity demanded. So let's see if we can and I won't, bore you as much as I can, I won't. But let's review this. A movement down the demand curve, right, caused an increase in quantity demanded. A movement is caused by a change in the selling price of the good itself, and it causes a change in quantity demanded. A change in the selling price causes a change in quantity demanded. A movement up the demand curve itself didn't change, just the price changed. So where the new price touched the demand curve did change, and that's called a decrease in quantity demanded. So a movement is only ever caused by a change in the selling price of the good itself, and that causes a decrease. A movement up the demand curve causes a decrease in quantity demanded. So when we're talking about price, we have to say quantity demanded, okay? However, when we're talking about a shift, an outward shift is called an increase in demand. There has been a change in quantity. I said it now. There's been a change in demand. And the reason why I said it is because I had the next thought in my head and saying, after a shift, don't say quantity demanded has changed. Say that demand has changed. So an outward shift is called an increase in demand, whereas an inward shift is called a decrease in demand. Just watch this video a few times to confuse you, okay? Because you just have to get used to that. And I will be repeating myself ad infinitum in later videos. And I hope now you have a better idea of what a shift is and the terminology. A shift causes a change in demand. A movement causes a change in quantity demanded.